Join our Patreon.
Do you really want to know? We are Mythvision.
Dr. Bob, Dr. Price, could you comment on the weight the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nag Hammadi had on the Jesus studies of historicity? So, is there any new evidence on either side, Nag Hammadi or the Dead Sea Scrolls, that give weight to the historicity of Jesus or mythicism? And there are people who think the Dead Sea Scrolls, all of them, are dubious. They're forged, fraud, whatever you want to call it. They're not real. But before we get to that, I think that's a simple answer. I wanted to say that prior to 1945, when we had the Nag Hammadi library found and the Dead Sea Scrolls in 47, 48, mythicists existed for many centuries. Do you think that the reason there's some weight on Dead Sea Scrolls that make most historians and scholars come in and go, mythicism would have been on a rise if we didn't find these documents, and now we have good reason to start weighing this into actual history and that Jesus probably existed? I mean, that's kind of where I'm going with the question. Is there any weight that these carry towards one direction or the other?
Yeah, I don't think so, actually. If anything, the scrolls have raised doubts with some people that, going way back into the 40s and the 50s, some have said, like John Allegro especially, said that it looks like the teacher of righteousness is just like Jesus in that he's betrayed by a wicked priest and executed, and his followers expected him to come back again to be vindicated. But that is not really clear. It does seem clear that the teacher of righteousness was persecuted by a rival high priest. But the rest of it is pretty darn iffy. It's not, the Dead Sea Scrolls are written in cipher language, so we're not really sure who anybody is supposed to be. Now, for instance, I think G.R. Driver, followed by Barbara Thiering, said that they thought that the teacher of righteousness, the founder of the sect, or at least their main teacher who taught them about the Pesher mode of interpretation, that he was John the Baptist. And that's sort of jumping the gun, though it's not absurd, because that rests on a long series of similarities between John as the Gospels depict him and the way the Essenes, or whoever they were at Qumran, lived, like down to the point of eating locusts, right? It said that John was a big fan of locusts and wild honey. So were these people. There's like recipes in the Dead Sea Scrolls for this. And they practice daily immersion. We don't know that John's baptism was daily, but I wouldn't be surprised. One of the church fathers speaks of the Hamero-Baptist sect, which means daily baptizers. I think the letter to the Hebrews speaks of repeated baptisms. And so John might have too. If there were crowds every day, it kind of implies that a lot of people came back for another dip to be ritually cleansed. He lived a life of ascetic poverty. Well, so did they. And he was in the same area of the Judean desert that Qumran is. And so there are, and he spoke of the coming judgment when the righteous will be baptized in spirit and the wicked in fire. And the very little we're told about John the Baptist, almost everything in it sounds like the people of the scrolls. So had John been a member and struck out on his own? Or was he a member even at the time? A lot of people have taken that seriously, and it would make sense. But the only problem with it is there were loads of these people around at the time, like what Martin Luther called the Schwärmerei, the swarming insects, as he was almost a Catholic. He was part of the magisterial Reformation with the liturgies and all that stuff. And the people that were real radicals, like the Anabaptists and the Schwenkfelders and all that, he thought they were nuts, and just like the Catholics thought he was. So, Robert Eisenman, Richard Carrier make a big deal out of this, quite rightly, that you can't assume there were only a few groups. There appeared to have been many. Could be tiny, but that doesn't really matter. But yeah, it's a natural inference that John was that he existed and was a member of this group or very similar to them. Was he the teacher of righteousness? Can't tell, because there's no name. They hushed everything up in code. Eisenman, I find very convincing when he says, well, yeah, not only that, but James the Just must have been the teacher of righteousness. And he revives the theory of Jacob Teichner that the Qumran sect was the Jerusalem Christian sect, and that Paul was the mocker and the spouter of lies who broke with the community over the issue of evangelizing Gentiles, the simple ones of Edom, I think they call them. But really, who knows?
I wanted to poke on that. I guess that's important to me. They didn't like the idea of evangelizing Gentiles, huh?
No, they well, not necessarily, but it seems like they thought you're making it too easy for them. That they shouldn't have any role in the covenant unless they sign on to the whole Torah. And that does sound an awful lot like Paul and the Jerusalem.
Right.
And so I take that real seriously. I kind of think that's the case. But again, no names are given, so you can't really be sure. And so this is how, like if Allegro was right, that the teacher of righteousness isn't, well, some have thought it was Jesus who was the teacher of righteousness, but it's hard to picture the Jesus of the Gospels being fanatical legalists like these guys were. And that's why Barbara Thiering says that Jesus was the wicked priest. He wanted to make things easier for people to join, and there's nothing doing. But and that's plausible too, but it's hard to say. Let's see. So there's been a lot of back and forth on that, but if Allegro is right, it almost leans in the direction of mythicism, saying Jesus really is kind of a mythologization of the teacher of righteousness, but there's not a whole lot of reason to think so. If Eisenman is right, it throws a whole different light on early Christianity and the Mandeans and John the Baptist and all that, because it attests what we already really knew, that there was this subculture of Semitic Gnostics in the Jordan Valley.
Could it also make sense of the references in Tacitus and stuff about, or maybe not Tacitus, where is it, Suetonius, that talks about Nero persecuting the Christians?
That's Tacitus.
Tacitus, sorry. But why? Why is he blaming them for the burning of Rome? All these things. It's like, well, that's because these Christians aren't the Christians that you think.
Though that would probably be the Zealots, and right. That's a reasonable theory. That
Jesus had a zealot for one of his disciples. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I take that seriously too. But there are too many possibilities, you just can't know.
Right.
But conservatives have said there are so many similarities between the Qumran sect and the early church, especially as depicted in Acts, and between their imagery and that of the Gospel of John, light versus darkness and all that, that kind of tells us where Jesus and the early church were coming from. And they like that because it makes it easier to say, yeah, they were really evolving from Judaism, because these scholars like Raymond Brown hate the idea that Gnosticism and mystery religions could have contributed to Christianity. They want Old Testament, New Testament, period. So they don't like that, and they say, well, hey, look at this. So you don't need to go to Gnosticism to explain the light versus darkness stuff. You don't need to, but the parallels between John's Gospel and various Gnostic and Mandean texts, as Bultmann shows in abundance, really is convincing to me. It's much closer than the Qumran people, though Bultmann also said that, well, I told you that there must have been Jewish Gnostics associated with these people, and bingo, the Dead Sea Scrolls prove that, because these guys would memorize the names of angels, presumably so they could give the names as passwords to the archons as they ascended to heaven upon death. And they had secret knowledge and all this stuff. So that's used as an apologetic, but I think wrongly.
I think it's funny, Dr. Bob. I like, things are on my mind. I don't want to lose while we go here. Mm-hmm. You talk about co-opting, right? We talk about a lot of co-opting. It makes me think, and just wondering, we get a little glimpse into a fictionalized early Christianity in Acts, which we know is fictional. Okay, not suggesting that there is, I'm not suggesting there couldn't be something being there. Like, hey, we're getting a little bit of a bias or a nuanced version, but we're seeing
Simon Magus is a perfect example of that.
And I'm thinking that co-op wise, do you think this can go to our Roman provenance buddies and say, look, early Christians were probably zealot type, were probably more radical, even if they were Gnostic to some degree. They could have possibly had a radical zealot type Gnostic angle. And here we have a co-opted version that cooperates with Rome. Hint, hint, Romans 12. Hint, hint, all these ideas that God puts them in power and that we should be obedient, turn the other cheek concepts and stuff. It sounds like there could be at the very least, pro-Roman Jews and such that are probably diaspora Jews that are cooperating with Rome and that are Hellenized, etc. At the most, we have Romans full-fledged involved with them saying, hey, let's collaborate our religious ideas here and make sure this co-ops. Sorry, I didn't want to poke in the middle of your Nag Hammadi Dead Sea Scroll thing, but do you think that could be the case?
Well, you don't need Gnosticism in that recipe, though.
Okay.
As long as you posit that there were zealot-type Christians, like Brandon and Eisler said, that'd be enough. I mean, I tend to think of the Gnostics, from what we know, as being quietists. They were really interested in escaping this vale of tears. I think they would have thought it was a big waste of time to try to change politics, just get the hell out of here. But there could have been overlap. It looks like there were Essenes who were zealots. One of them is named so-and-so the Essene, one of the bigwigs among the zealots. So who knows? Eisenman says it's almost as if all these sect labels were different names for the same thing. And that's, I don't know that you'd need the Gnostic element. It could have been in there.
But the Nag Hammadi library supports more, doesn't prove anything ultimately, but it supports more of the mythicist approach because it's very Gnostic, or what? I mean, would you agree with that?
Well, there's Docetism in there, but I don't think it's all that prominent. Something like the Acts of John, it has a docetic view of Jesus, the most explicitly so of any ancient document, but it doesn't appear to be Gnostic. It's Encretite, and they thought, well, Jesus wouldn't be caught dead in a stinking husk of flesh like we are, so he must not have had one, but they don't appear to be Gnostic, though you do have Gnostic elements that have been included, like the round dance of the Savior in the Acts of John. And anybody who's interested in that ought to watch the great movie Eye of the Devil from the early 60s, which involves Mithraism and Gnosticism in this mystery thing. It's very much like The Wicker Man, though earlier. Sharon Tate is in it, David Niven, Deborah Carr, Donald Pleasance. It is a great film. eye of the devil. And anyway, Jesus has less to do with, well, there are Gnostic apocalypses in there that seem to have been superficially Christianized, like the Apocalypse of Adam, which is originally a Zoroastrian work, and speaks of the Illuminator coming again and again, and it looks like Jesus has been added on to the end of it. There's Melchizedek, which seems to be the product of two different Melchizedek sects that must have merged because they were both on hard times and losing members. Augustine or somebody tells us that he knew of two different Melchizedek sects, one Gnostic, one not. And it looks to me like what we have is a result of them fusing together and so on. And that's adapted to Jesus, though originally Melchizedek is identified with Seth, also from Genesis. This incredible diversity of early Christian Gnosticism is one of the reasons I think that it's going to take an awful lot of study, and a lot has been done, at least for me to say anything decent about the Nag Hammadi texts. But I don't know that you can apply the Nag Hammadi texts to mythicism directly, but you can kind of do the next best thing, because it surely debunks this apologetic that, oh, no Christians would have added any sayings of their own to Jesus and made him the mouthpiece of their views. You can actually see it happening because if there's a copy of the Epistle of Eugnostos, good knowledge, Eugnostos the Blessed, which is a treatise about the resurrection and stuff, and all that. And then there is the Dialogue of the Savior, and you can see that somebody simply sliced a copy of Eugnostos and interspersed the statements with questions by the disciples to make Jesus the spokesman here.
Right.
There's no claim that he was originally, but they said, oh, that sounds so good, Jesus must have said it. So he did. And who knows? I mean, if you can do that, and it's obvious they did it. All these other Gnostic texts, the Pistis Sophia, the Wisdom of Jesus Christ, the Hypostasis of the Archons, all of them pretend to be telling you what Jesus said, usually after the resurrection or even after the ascension. And it's just preposterous to say, as apologists do, well, every evidence tells us that they wouldn't have attributed their own ideas to Jesus. Kind of wake up. These guys aren't early Christians, and they're, of course, what they're really thinking is, well, they're heretics, they don't count. It's totally circular.
You're not my brand, so I don't hear you. Your voice doesn't matter because you're not my brand.
Yeah.
And the crazy thing is, what I love about you, what I love about all these guys, historicists, mythicists alike, I love all of them. I'll tell you why. It just short and simple to exactly what you're saying here. They point out the inconsistencies and issues even between the voices of whoever's behind these writings in the very canon that they want to say is their voice. And that's a problem. The harmonizers, which a lot of them are my friends, I try to point out, as much as they want to marry James and Paul, these guys were enemies, at least as sects. Okay, they were enemy sects. I don't know if he bumped into them on the road, if he was going to pull out a club and say, let's go at it. They could have, but that's reading too much into it. It is obvious, one of them saying, let him be accursed. Mm-hmm. And I take Galatians 1 to be talking to these sects. Mm-hmm. So when he says someone who's preaching another gospel, I'm going to tell you, hint, hint, I'm visiting these guys. Do you see? I bumped into these people. That's my opinion.
Oh, yeah.
So this is just, that doesn't sound like, he wasn't very kind. Whoever's behind the writings of these, they're not very friendly with these other people. And so I'm with you. I just think that they should broaden their perspective. But if they're not willing to even do that in their own book, I don't think they're ever going to consider any of these other writings.
they're just spin doctors. That's why it's kind of a waste to debate them. They would rather mire you in that kind of endless repetition so that you don't have time to do any kind of pioneering or novel thinking on this. Oh, no, play with us over here. The same game we've been playing forever. No, I'm sick of that. I'm doing my own thing here. And, oh yeah, about the, whether the Dead Sea Scrolls are, I gotta say, Margaret Barker, who I think the world of, in her book, The Risen Lord, she says that Jesus did say the kind of stuff attributed to him in the Nag Hammadi text, so that she takes that to be historical Jesus stuff. I haven't read that book, I will shortly. But with the notion that the Dead Sea Scrolls are all fraudulent, somebody argued that back in the 50s, but what they meant was that they thought these were medieval documents written by the Karaite sect of Jews who were anti-rabbinical. They thought, good God, these people have obscured the Torah behind all these hundreds of extra commandments. Let's just forget that stuff and go back to the Torah. And they were considered heretics. They were started by Anan ben David. And the people that suggested the Dead Sea Scrolls are Karaite documents, they weren't completely wrong, because we know that the Karaites discovered a stash of Dead Sea Scrolls, though we don't have them anymore. But apparently it was one of several caches of these scrolls that were hidden to protect them. And that's why there are similarities between the Karaites and some of the stuff in the scrolls. They decided, well, this must be the original Judaism, let's go with this stuff.
Wow.
And so yeah, there's a link, but it's not what they thought. I mean, you can get that much from the carbon dating and so on.
So the simple answer to them being, they're not all fraud.
No.
Just because the Christian bought some black market versions and had to reap what he sows for doing it. I don't know. I'm just...
Yeah, people are suckers when it comes to biblical discoveries. A number of things like the James Ossuary and so on appear to be just fakes to bilk these seekers. You want a gospel of so-and-so? I happen to have one right here. Give me a few weeks and I'll... Yeah. This happened way back when the British ruled India. The missionaries were real interested to know if there were parallels between ancient Indian stories and the Bible. And so these guys would bring manuscripts that mentioned Abraham and so on. And you are right, right here it says Abraham and so forth. Oh, wow. And it was just fakery. Max Muller wrote about that. Don't be taken in by this crap. And the longest lived one of these was the Unknown Life of Jesus Christ by Nicholas Natovich, who was a Russian journalist and spy who claimed to have been given shelter in a Tibetan monastery after he broke his leg mountain climbing. And he said that the lamas told him, we have the life of Saint Isa, the best of the sons of men. Want to hear it? And so he said they read from it, and that this showed how Jesus had gone to Tibet to learn everything, and so on. But it was debunked, but people are still buying it and reading it. It was apparently based on the Aquarian Gospel, which is also still avidly read, but fraudulent. And so it still goes on, and there are new Gospels being written all the time. Karen King got suckered by the so-called Gospel of Jesus' wife. Richard Arthur, a colleague of mine, he argued that the Gospel of Judas is a modern fake. And he and I asked him, well, in that case, I bet so-and-so wrote it. And he said, yeah. And so it's just, or some of these things, monuments, supposedly a piece of Solomon's temple, it looks like, yeah, no, these were manufactured for the gullible.
Join our Patreon